IELTS Academic Task 1. Score above 7 band. The opening sentence must say what the graph is about. For example, this graph shows the number of tourist arrivals in Japan in the years 1990, 2000, and 2010 from Australia, USA, UK, and South Africa. The introduction must have 3 main points. The first point is, what is this graph or chart about? The second point must be the data shown on the y-axis as well as the x-axis. So in this graph you can see that tourists arrived from 4 countries, so that must be included in the opening statement. Finally, there should be a reference to the time. For instance, in this graph you see that the data is for 1990, 2000, and 2010. This is a sample IELTS Task 1 bar graph. Let's take a good look at this bar graph and understand how to write or how to begin writing the IELTS Task 1. Okay, if you see the title here, it says Tourist Arrivals in Japan. So it's very important that you first look at the title and understand what it's about. Then look at the data points on the x-axis. Here you see that tourists from Australia, USA, UK, and South Africa is shown in this graph. And on the y-axis there are some numbers. So you see a 0, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, and 60,000. That's the scale. So how do we begin writing? The most important thing, as mentioned earlier, is that your introduction or the opening statement should clearly state what this graph is about, what does it show, and highlight the data points as well as a time reference. So let's begin by writing the opening statement right away. So I would begin by saying this graph shows, what does it show? It shows tourist arrivals in Japan. Shows tourist arrivals in Japan from where? From Australia, USA, UK, and South Africa. From Australia, USA, UK, and South Africa. Well, we must not forget to include the time reference. In what years? So we say in the years 1990, 2000, and 2010. So here's your opening statements. There are many other ways to write this down, but I would like to standardize the opening statement and simply use it as an introduction. Include the title, include the data points, and a time reference. That's about it. It shouldn't take you more than 5 seconds to write this down. Okay, so now let's look at what next. Now that you've written the introduction or stated what this graph is about, we have to look at how to write. What is the strategy? Now, there are a couple of ways to write about the data that you see in this graph. To begin with, you don't have to write everything that you see. You just need to write the main features. Make sure that you write some comparisons and also state some similarities if there are any. And in the conclusion, look at the overall picture. Well, that's how you should write 150 words. 150 words is just about 15 lines, assuming that there are 10 words in a line. So you could write at least 15 lines or 150 words. And here we go. Let's begin. I would like to look at Australia first. What do we see here? We see that 20,000 tourists from Australia arrived in Japan in the year 1990. It then increased to how much is that? If you're not sure, you can definitely be sure that it's over 20,000. Okay? And then what happened in 2010? In 2010, it fell. The number of tourists arriving in Japan from Australia fell to just a little over 10,000. So here are some ways to write about these graphs. So the first statement is to say what you see. The data here is, what is it? It's the number. So on the y-axis you have numbers. So if you had percentages here, you would say percentage of. If you had something else there, then you would mention a different variable. But since you have numbers out here, you would say the number of tourists arriving from Australia, Australia in Japan in the year 1990 were 20,000. Okay, now what's very important is to highlight what is the subject. The subject that we are writing about here is extremely important. It's also important to find other words in which you can express the subject or the topic for this particular graph. So it happens to be tourist arrivals in Japan. There are many different ways to say the same thing, and we call that paraphrasing. So let's paraphrase tourist arrivals in Japan. We could say tourists going to Japan. Okay, Australian tourists arriving in Japan. A couple of different ways. So it's always nice to change the words but not the topic in general, just to make it a little less monotonous. Okay, so let's begin by writing about Australian tourists first. So we're going to use a different set of words to describe the same thing. You would say Australian tourists tourists going to Japan in the year 2000, and then you use the verb increased, then say to a little over 20,000. or you can say over 20,000. Then it fell to just over 10,000. So we have to say, when did it fall? And then in 2010, it here refers to the subject, Australian tourists going to Japan, the number of Australian tourists going to Japan. It fell to just over 10,000. When? And that is alright. So that's what happened with tourist arrivals from Australia to Japan. Now the main features is not just mentioning everything about every other country here in the graph. So you just need to glide over the main features. Obviously, you could see here that the tourists from United States numbered the most. So you could say that the highest number of tourists came from the United States in all the 3 years. That's a clear fact. You can see that. So usage of superlatives or comparatives is necessary in this topic, or in this writing task 1 of the IELTS. So let's use superlative, and in this graph you see that the highest number of tourists came from the USA in all the 3 years. Okay. So it's kind of difficult to say that which one's the lowest, because UK and South Africa seem to have similar numbers. However, it's clear that South Africa sent less tourists than UK at 10,000 in the year 1990. Okay. So instead of doing some complicated calculations, you could make a generic statement about UK and South Africa. You could say the tourists coming from South Africa and the UK were, sorry, you gotta say the number of tourists coming from South Africa and the UK was the least. Alright. Now, let's go to the overall picture. What's been happening to tourist arrivals in Japan from all these countries? You can see that in 1990, the number from 1990 to 2010, there were 2 countries where the number of tourists increased overall. 2 countries. And in 2 countries, it either declined or fell. So that's an important observation. So let's look at United States. All the 3 years, they were just increasing. In Australia, they fell. And so in the UK. So you could say that overall the number of tourists going to Japan fell. Okay, overall the number of tourists going to Japan from Australia and UK fell, whereas it marginally increased or slightly increased, okay, in the case of South Africa, and there was a steady or constant rise or increase in the number of tourists from the USA. Alright, so that is a good comparison to say that USA consistently contributed more than the others. Okay, let's write this down. So you can say the number of tourists from the USA consistently increased. And let's put the numbers down from little over or over 40,000 to over 50,000. So you could say increased from over 40,000 in 1990 to over 50,000 in 2010. Okay, so let's look at another place. Let's look at UK. What happened in the UK? And so let's use a contrast statement because it's different. It shows a decline in UK. So you say, whereas number of tourists from the UK declined in the same period from how much did it decline? From, well, it looks like nearly 15,000 to less than 15,000. So nearly, because I can't be pretty accurate about the number when you look at a graph like this, because there are no numbers between 10,000 and 20,000. So what you see is an assumption. So we'll try to be as cautious as possible. So you could say, well, the number of tourists from UK declines in the same period from nearly 15,000 to a little over 10,000. Okay. So you can also look at this data in another way. You could look at the data in terms of years. You could see that in 1990 to 2000, there was an overall increase. Yes, in all the countries except UK. So that's a point worth mentioning. Okay, let's look at that. In 1990, the overall, or the total number of tourist arrivals in Japan from these four countries increased. Sorry, in 2000 it increased. In 2000, the total number of tourist arrivals in Japan went up. So let's not keep saying increased all the time. So let's say went up. From all these four countries. I'm sorry, I have a few issues with typing here. But, okay, so this is how it should look. In 2000, the total number of tourist arrivals in Japan from these four countries went up. Okay. And you can use another yeah, it went up. Alright. So after we do this, we write about South Africa and UK. Or you could also say that there is a general decline in the number of tourists arriving in Japan from Australia and South Africa. So you could say there was a general decline in the number of tourists arriving in Japan from South Africa and the UK. Sorry, and Australia. As you can see here, there was a decline. So South Africa, and in the year, so we have to mention in the year 2010. This one is a sample graph, so the data presented here is not the full IELTS question. Generally, in the IELTS task 1, there are graphs that have a lot more data, and you could comfortably write about 150 words. This is a sample, so you would generally write like this. So this could get you a score of over 6 bands for sure, because it does have an introduction, then it does make some comparisons, and there is some conclusion, which is the overall picture. I would like to break this up into 3 paragraphs just to signal the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And to count the number of words, I would usually use the method of counting the number of lines. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So we fell short of 2 more lines. Well, but this is a sample, and in our next sample, we shall take a question directly from an IELTS test that people have taken, and then try to solve that or write for that particular question. So until the next video, thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something out of this video, and I hope you get a good score in IELTS. And please share, subscribe, and leave your comments.